lot of people signed up for tonight's event, which is NYC's next mayor and America's Jewish future. We should have that all covered and wrapped up for you within the next hour. So it's going to be really interesting. We're very happy you're with us. I am Rachel Fishman Feddersen. I am the CEO and publisher of The Forward, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight because this is one of our member events. This is especially for you, our supporters. We are very grateful to you. And we have these meetings, events, especially to give you, our supporters, an opportunity to hear firsthand from our journalists, to really hear their voices and hear directly and hear them interact with each other. Sometimes the conversation is just like what you would hear around the newsroom, and it just can give you a flavor of the kind of work and thinking you're supporting. So we're really happy you're here and you'll get the opportunity to hear our journalists in conversation. Everybody knows this is a time of extraordinarily rapid change in the Middle East, for example, here in the US, around the world. And it is really great to have so many friends of the Forward here tonight. You will not be surprised to hear that reporting in this news environment, where there are just stories constantly to be told and culture to be celebrated and ideas to be explored, it takes a lot of resources. We have just completed our high holiday fundraiser, but you will not be surprised to hear it is never too late to contribute to the Forward, and there is a link in the chat. Your gift has an immediate impact on our ability to do this work, and we could not be more grateful to you. So thank you. Here's just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We have a lot of attendees and it's a packed schedule, so we will be sending you a recording of this event in the next few days. And if you have questions, this is really important. If you want to have a shot at getting your questions addressed, please put them in the Q&A section, not the chat. The Q&A section is where the panelists are looking for your question. In case I'm not saying that clearly, it's the Q&A, question and answer section. Okay, now on to our discussion. So I am delighted this evening to welcome 4 Forward journalists: our wonderful interim editor-in-chief, Julie Moose, our senior political reporter, Jacob Kornblue, our enterprise reporter, Arno Rosenfeld, and our opinion editor, Talia Zaks. And I will just turn it over to my colleagues and we will start our discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you all for being here. We know that many of you have been following the New York City mayoral primary and full general election race pretty closely. And some of you may have tuned in more recently. So before our journalists start diving into the questions raised by the rise of Zohran Mamdani and what it means for Jews in New York and across the country, just want to share a little bit of background. So, and watch the chat for some links from us as well. So, as you may know, Mamdani, who just turned 34 on Saturday, has been representing part of Queens in the New York State Assembly for about 5 years. And while his rapid rise as the Democratic nominee for mayor has led some New York Jews and some Jews elsewhere to debate whether a mayor who opposes Zionism can effectively lead at a time of rising anti-Semitism, there are Jews who have supported them, some high profile like Bernie Sanders, and Jews in his Queens district who have come to know him have a particularly nuanced view. So we're going to share a link in the chat to the reporting that we have done on how his Astoria district feels about Zohran Mamdani. Back in April, he told Jacob, who you've met, over a bowl of chicken soup, quote, "Whether you agree or disagree, you know exactly how I feel about something." And that has proven to be very true, particularly when it comes to his feelings about Palestinians, the war in Gaza, and Israel. And you'll hear from Arno Rosenfeld, who you also have already met, about those views in a moment. But just want to give you a little bit more of the lay of the land. So Mamdani obviously upset former Governor Cuomo in the Democratic primary and looks poised to do about the same in the general election. But 60% of likely voters who are Jewish said they plan to support Cuomo, and 29% said they would support Mamdani, according to a Quinnipiac University poll released about 2 weeks ago. A smaller poll of Jewish voters taken just before last week's debate shows it a little more evenly split. We'll know more soon. So the race obviously has implications not just for New York City, but for Democrats and for Jews across the country. The stakes are high. A lot of intense emotion around this topic, and you'll hear from Talia how Jews on both sides have made their cases for and against Mamdani. One more housekeeping note to add to the ones that Rachel shared. In order to have a single focused discussion with our panel, we've limited the chat options. So just to reiterate, leave your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to as many as we can. Okay, so we're going to start with the facts. Mamdani's actual positions on Jews and Israel. So Arno, let's start with you. What has he said? What's prompted accusations of anti-Semitism, and how has he fought back against them?
Yeah, so, I think in several cases it has been what he hasn't said or the absence of comments that he has made. So, going back to college earlier, he's been very deeply involved in pro-Palestinian activism. That hasn't been a core aspect of his campaign for mayor, but it has come up because people who've been aware of this have pressed him on it, and because he's put out statements, of course, around things like the anniversary of October 7th, etc. His line is that Israel has a right to exist as a country, but not as a Jewish state. Um, and that rankled a lot of people. Similarly, he did not initially sort of condemn the slogan "globalize the Intifada," so it wasn't language that he was using, but he did not condemn it when asked. And similarly, he sort of dodged some questions here and there about Hamas. He hasn't certainly come out in favor of Hamas, and he said during the debate that they should lay down their arms, but he hasn't, forcefully condemned it in the way that some people would have liked. Similarly, when he talks about the conflict, there's been a complaint that, his condemnation of the violence against Israelis on October 7th, for example, was sort of perfunctory, and he has a lot more emotion when he talks about Palestinian suffering. And then, of course, he has repeatedly accused Israel of genocide, and he's also said that he would arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu if he came to New York City, which is, quite a stark contrast, right, with his opponent, Andrew Cuomo, who, volunteered to serve on Netanyahu's legal defense team in the International Criminal Court. So I think that's a basic kind of primer on what he's actually said, what he's gone on the record with. Was there a second part to the question?
Yeah, so that's great. That was a great summation, distillation. So talk a little bit about the accusations of anti-Semitism and how he has fought back against them.
Yeah, so he has kind of interestingly, it's a relatively unique approach. He really hasn't changed his position on almost anything. He did on Globalize the Intifada, that slogan, which was always sort of, again, he wasn't using it himself, so it was always a little bit ancillary to his campaign. He did sort of agree subsequently to discourage people from using it, but he hasn't gone around and really done that either. So he hasn't shifted substantively, but without shifting, he has really courted Jewish voters. And so during the primary, he participated in the UJA Federation mayoral forum, for example. He sat for interviews with the Jewish press. He did a lot of Jewish outreach, and then ultimately one of his main surrogates or sort of co-campaigners was Brad Lander, who is the city's Jewish comptroller, who identifies as a liberal Zionist. And I think a big part of what he did was try to reassure, and we've seen this as he campaigns in the general too, try to reassure New Yorkers that despite not being a Zionist himself, he doesn't want to demonize Israel's supporters in New York City, in the United States, and in the city that he would be representing. He said to visit a synagogue in Brooklyn recently, that he would hire Zionists to work in his administration. There would be no litmus test around Israel for positions in his mayoral office. So that's been the approach that he's taken, and that stands in contrast to what we've seen from other politicians who share some of his politics, but have not found the same sort of electoral success as he has. So if you look at Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, two very progressive members of the House Democratic Caucus who lost their primaries after a lot of pressure from Jewish groups, Cori Bush basically cut off Jewish leaders in her St. Louis district who she disagreed with after she was elected. And so people felt not only like they disagreed with her on the substance, but also like they weren't in any sort of communication or relationship. And so I think Mamdani has put a lot of energy into trying to convince Jewish voters who disagree with him on Israel that they can still work with him on other matters.
Thank you. And for those who want to see a little bit more about this, we have a piece that Arno wrote that I'm going to share in the chat about why some of the claims of anti-Semitism have not stuck to Mamdani in the way they have maybe for some others. So so some people I think were maybe surprised when he won the primary, or it seemed sudden, but it didn't actually happen in a vacuum. So Talia, I wonder if you could start connecting the dots for us from the uncommitted movement, which refused to support Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris over the war in Gaza, to Mamdani's success.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And I apologize. I think I'm having some video issues, so please just bear with me. So back in the presidential campaign cycle in 2024, Zohran Mamdani was a supporter of the uncommitted movement. He was encouraging people to volunteer with them. He was sharing the same kinds of ideas about the Middle East that we've heard him sharing on the campaign trail today, which are very closely aligned with the ideas that were put forward by the uncommitted movement. And then in the time that has followed, we've seen a lot of those ideas move even more to the mainstream than they were back in the presidential campaign. And that can feel a bit confusing because I know the presidential campaign feels like a long time ago already, but the conversation about Israel and Gaza was so prominent within that campaign that it's a little bit astonishing to realize that the pro-Palestinian movement within the Democratic Party has become even more powerful since then. Um, but it has. And the evidence of that, perhaps most clearly, is that former Vice President Kamala Harris herself has endorsed Mamdani. She did so at first in a sort of tepid way on TV, and then followed up by initiating a phone call to him. And even though she's not a candidate for president anymore, that one gesture is a really significant signal of how mainstream within the Democratic Party Mamdani's politics have become, and the politics of the uncommitted movement. And, something that is worth understanding here is that oftentimes when there's a really significant social movement that doesn't necessarily get immediate political successes, it echoes out through the years that follow. So we saw this, for example, with Occupy Wall Street, which, for instance, did not have great success at changing the financial industry or its relationship to politics immediately. But 10 years, or sorry, not 10 years later, I briefly lost track of time. All these years later, the changes in the way that politicians on the left, including Mamdani, including Bernie Sanders, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the way that they all speak about the finance world and the world of finance and politics really reflects that movement. So I think we're seeing something similar with Uncommitted here, where Uncommitted was initially not that effective at, bringing about political change. Joe Biden was the candidate, and then Kamala Harris was the candidate. And it appears my video is frozen. I apologize for that. But now we're seeing that social movement sort of reap long-term gains.
Thank you for that. We also, I just realized, have a question about the uncommitted movement. So, Jacob, I'm actually going to come to you to do just a sentence on uncommitted, so everybody who didn't understand what it is understands. But also, I'd like you to just talk about whether there are other candidates following Mamdani's lead in other races in the country, and what that might mean for Jews.
Well, first of all, the uncommitted movement, the link that people make to the uncommitted movement is that they had this massive success in moving the conversation on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It wasn't necessarily they had electoral success because Joe Biden was running until he withdrew from the race, and then Kamala Harris refused to move a little more to their side in order to clinch the election. And so, with the rise of Zohran Mamdani, but also the shift in the conversation within the Jewish community itself, but also amongst candidates running for office, they see that shifting from a protest movement to an actual movement that could win elections. Zohran Mamdani is only one of them. You have in Michigan the Senate candidate Abdul El Sayed. That you have other candidates across the country who are relatively new to politics, who are young, who are also very articulate. You even have Jewish candidates or even longtime mainstream Democrats who are now talking out in a more critical tone towards Israel and the Israeli government. And that sort of gives an opening to those candidates who have always criticized Israel, those politicians who are always considered on the fringe. The Squad was a name that you couldn't mention in a positive manner. Those people feel that the conversation around this conflict has changed, that you can actually translate that energy and that motivation of, fixing the injustice to an electoral success. And what it means for Jews is that we have to focus on what matters to us on a daily basis, not necessarily centered around Israel, not because the candidates are not willing to listen to our concerns, not because the candidates are moving more towards the Palestinian narrative of this conflict, but because there is this change in the country, both on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side, where Israel has become sort of that negative take on what people think about what you need to do actual to improve the lives of all Americans and how to deal with conflicts around the world. And that conversation is something that has changed from the uncommitted movement, but also likely to change in the coming year as we move into the midterms.
Um, Excellent, thank you. Um, so you're all kind of identifying the confluence of these factors that both reflect various tensions in the electorate and also exacerbate them. And so I want to make sure that we tease those out a little bit more. So Talia, talk a little bit about what some of these arguments for and against Jews supporting Mamdani are. And just to say again, like, this is not just a debate that's happening among people who will be casting ballots or already maybe have in New York, but Jews across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as the opinion editor at The Forward, I have seen the full range, I think, of the opinions for and against Mamdani within the Jewish community. And I think it basically boils down to a few big points on each side. Obviously, I can't give the whole nuanced view within this answer, which is part of why you should read our opinion section, but this is the big picture. So, for the Jews who are supporting Mamdani, there are a few big points. The first is that among the mayoral candidates, his plan to combat hate crimes in the city is potentially the most substantial. Jews who support Mamdani like to point to the claim that his platform would increase funding for hate crime prevention by 800%. So they see a candidate who's aware of how extensive the concerns about rising identitarian violence are and really is invested in addressing that, including for Jews. That's point one. Point two, a lot of Jewish voters actually appreciate Mamdani's stance on the Middle East, even if they don't wholeheartedly agree with it. And you can see this not just in the New York City electorate, but in the national electorate. A new-ish Washington Poll post suggested that 61% of American Jews think Israel committed war crimes in Gaza, and 39% think its actions there constituted a genocide. Now, again, that's American Jews writ large. It's not specifically New York City Jews. But when you see those kinds of numbers, you can understand that there are Jewish voters in New York who see Mamdani's criticism of Israel, and even if they don't agree on every point, they resonate with it. That's point number two. Point number three on the for side is they see themselves as voting as New Yorkers on New York issues and just don't see any disagreement that they might have with Mamdani about the Middle East as being that relevant to the things that they want to see done in their city by their next mayor. And they also see Mamdani as, showing potential for growth. There was one rabbi, Rachel Timoner at Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn, who told the New York Times that many of her congregants feel that he's been working to understand Jewish concerns and adjusting his interactions with them accordingly. So those are the big points on the side for Mamdani. On the side against Mamdani, the really big argument is that somebody who has the degree of criticism toward Israel that he has, whose political identity is so enmeshed with that degree of criticism of Israel, cannot be a good mayor for Jews because Jews are so connected with Israel. And this was expressed, I saw that a question in the Q&A mentioned Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove's sermon over this weekend, telling his congregants not to vote for Mamdani. For those who don't know, Rabbi Cosgrove, he's the chief rabbi at Park Ave Synagogue, which is a very major New York City congregation. And he had this line in what he said, where he said, as Jews, Ahavat Israel, love of Israel, does take precedence over other loves, basically arguing that Mamdani's perspectives on Israel preclude him from being able to really understand a Jewish electorate or respond to their concerns or protect them from hate. So on the side of Jews who are against Mamdani, that is the overarching big argument, so big that it's almost singular. Within that argument, there are some nuances, including the concern that Mamdani will potentially be okay at addressing anti-Semitism from the right, but really struggle when it comes to anti-Semitism from the left because that's his political home. And if he sees it as anti-Zionist, maybe he won't be able to really perceive it accurately or engage with it in a way that is, that gives Jews a sense of safety and security in their city. But zooming out, the big thing that I've seen from my seat is that the rhetoric around this race has been extremely heated in ways that I think have made it difficult for Jewish voters across the spectrum to necessarily really get a picture of what a Mamdani mayorship would be. Sorry for the confusion there. I've even seen comparisons between him and Karl Lueger, who was the infamous anti-Semitic mayor in Vienna at the start of the 20th century, who inspired Hitler. And, I see a comparison like that, and no matter what you think of Mamdani, the facts don't support it. It's impossible to imagine a man like Luger putting on a kippah and going to Yom Kippur services, which Mamdani did. So, you know, the fact that that comparison is out there in the first place is kind of evidence of how profound the emotional reactions are here, and that has made the landscape a little bit harder to understand for everyone, regardless of their political affiliation.
Thank you for that. That amazing in warp speed summation of the positions for and against, and for including Rabbi Cosgrove's positions in there. And thank you for a couple of people who asked about that. So you mentioned outreach. And Jacob, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that outreach has been and how it's changed, if it has, since the primary, and how, Brad Lander and Jerry Nadler have factored into that.
Yeah, so first, just to follow up on Talia's lead, it's also worth mentioning that Mamdani's campaign, his senior staff are Jews. The masterminds of his political success are Jewish New Yorkers, and they continue to have his ear and be very influential in his campaign, but also in his outreach. And that just tells you that, it's not about that yarmulke on Yom Kippur or in the sukkah of this Williamsburg rabbi, but it's also that Mamdani has paid attention to the diversity of the Jewish community in New York while not shifting his positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because his argument is that he will not limit free speech on the Jewish side of the aisle when it comes in support of Israel, right? If he won't march in the Israeli Day Parade, that doesn't mean he won't send the NYPD to protect them. If he's not going to go to a synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, that doesn't mean that he's not going to instruct the NYPD to station outside the synagogues to protect them. And that has been his message constantly from when he was a long shot candidate in the primary, when nobody wanted to meet with him or consider him as a viable candidate, to now being the front runner and the Democratic nominee. And I think that has changed, because when you do outreach and you are in the single digits or you're not a viable candidate, people will say, I don't have time to meet with you, or we are not meeting with any of the candidates, we are staying neutral. But when he is the Democratic nominee and you have to consider his alliances or your alliances with the Democratic Party and the local politicians, and when you understand that in the likelihood is that he will become the next mayor at least for the next 4 years, you have to engage, or at least when he reaches out his hand, not to dismiss him and not to reject him. And that has been the case in the last few weeks, where Mamdani has not met necessarily with the heads of the mainstream Jewish organizations, who continue to issue press releases and lists of demands on X in order to get his attention, but with those who will actually make up the majority of the Jewish community, including the Orthodox voting blocs, who won't necessarily endorse him, or who might mobilize for Andrew Cuomo, and some even for Curtis Lewa. That's for separate discussion. And the cracks there have been significant, because there are various communities, including the influential Satmar community, who say, we will not have a say in this election. We will not influence the election. The primary showed that over 100,000 people made up the gap between Mamdani and Andrew Cohen. Even if all of the Jewish voting blocs and everybody would mobilize against Mamdani, he would still win the election. Right now, even in a head-to-head matchup, the polls show that he has the lead. And so what they say, we have to protect our interests, and we have to talk and engage with those who will be in office for the next 4 years. And that has been the case not only with Mamdani, but also with those who are affiliated, who have allied with him, that they have sort of opened the door, even with their experience of knowing the community. Brad Lander and Jerry Nadler are not necessarily considered mainstream of the Jewish community. They are more the progressive lane, especially shifting on the conflict in recent months. But they know the community, they have experience with the community, they have the contact list of those who actually make up the leadership of the Jewish community. They've borrowed that experience, but also legitimized those liberal Jews who don't consider the conflict to be the main issue at front of them, but also consider the policies of likely the next mayor, to engage with him in a very constructive manner.
So let's turn to the people who are not supporting him, particularly Chuck Schumer. And who, has offered sort of, I don't know how to just characterize it, but, whatever minimum amount of acknowledgement that they have worked together on some things, but he has stopped well shy of endorsing him, and has his own sort of political struggles at the moment. But talk about the way that this race's impact extends beyond New York and has surfaced shifts in the state politics, but also for Jewish Democrats like Schumer.
So first of all, Chuck Schumer has his own lane. He has been there for years. Wherever there's a controversy or whenever there's an issue that people demand him speaking out, he will not be there. And so it's not necessarily when it comes to Zohran Mamdani. Whenever there is an issue that sort of divides the Jewish community, you look back in 2015 when he came out against the Iran deal, he did that in a way where he sort of put not his political weight behind it, because he could have mobilized the Democrats to reject it and the Senate to have veto power over the president. But he voiced his opposition and said, I myself cannot support it. And so you have that approach here as well, where he says, I will not reject Mamdani. I will meet with him. They talk on the phone. They've spoken numerous times, and they will meet on different occasions. But he will not go there to support him, yet he won't endorse any other candidates or speak out against him. And that is sort of the approach that has kept him as a politician in New York politics for years. You mentioned his struggles, and therefore I also think that because he understands that his future as the Democratic leader in the Senate, or even in 2028 when he runs for re-election, is uncertain, that he doesn't have to have a say because it won't have any political implications on him. And when you talk about how Schumer himself is this example of how the mainstream Jewish Democrats have shifted on towards Israel. If you know, so much has happened the last year, but one can recall his speech in the Senate on anti-Semitism, but also calling for a change in leadership in Israel. That obviously didn't happen. The conversation centering around, we stand with Israel, we are Zionists, we support Israel militarily, and will uh, continue to fund whatever Israel needs in terms of to protect itself and to defend itself against terrorism, will still speak out against the Israeli government. Will still voice our support for a two-state solution. And when the president puts forward a plan that we think could lead to viable peace, we will stand there and back that. You look at Josh Shapiro, you look at JB Pritzker, they have moved a little further to the left for the very reason that they are running for re-election. JB Pritzker is running for another term of governor, potentially for president. Josh Shapiro is also running next year for governor and potentially for president. Other politicians like Richie Torres, who have always stood out as the most defensive allies of the Jewish community and of Israel, allies of AIPAC. You see, there are races now, including the Seth Moulton statement recently that they rejected AIPAC money and will not seek their support, which shows that the Democratic Party, not only the base of the Democratic Party, has changed in its empathy towards the Palestinians in the conflict, or the conversation about the Gaza war and largely the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also the politics around it. You have potentially candidates who will run against you, will primary you, who will be successful if you do not take a stance on this issue. And that is where they have stood, where we, you know, the same as Zohran Mamdani does, which is says, I'm still a supporter of the Palestinian rights, but I'll still meet with Jews or appoint Zionists to my administration. What they are saying, we are still staunch supporters of Israel, but we'll still speak out in for human rights and in support of a Palestinian state.
Thank you. So related electoral issue, Arno, talk about where anti-Semitism falls now as a campaign issue and whether or how it matters to Jewish voters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I wrote about this when Mamdani won the primary, that the framework that American Jews, or I should say American Jewish organizations, the largest organizations in the kind of establishment like the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, etc., had relied on this model that really, combined or viewed a refusal to support a Jewish state in Israel, so whether that's explicitly anti-Zionism or something else, viewed that as anti-Semitic and sought to kind of discipline that sort of speech. So whether that meant, and this wasn't what the ADL and AJC were doing, but groups with similar politics, and certainly AIPAC poured a lot of money into races against candidates that held those views toward Israel and often succeeded, right? I mentioned Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. And then if you look on college campuses, there's been this push to get them to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. That's been sort of the Trump administration's approach. But none of those things really required uh, a Democratic vote. I mean, Trump was elected, but he wasn't elected primarily on anti-Semitism. Students don't get to vote on what anti-Semitism policy their school uses. And then even in the races where anti-Semitism was an issue for Jews. So in Jamal Bowman's race, for example, a lot of people considered him to be anti-Semitic, but the ads that, for example, AIPAC took out against him weren't focused on anti-Semitism. They were focused on other weak points in his record. And so I think that created a sense that this idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic and beyond the pale and that anti-Zionists should be shunned was an effective one, right? Many Jews believed that, but also it worked. We were seeing it kind of play out in the real world. And what Mamdani's victory in the primary showed, I think, is that when you put that to a vote, because in New York, a lot of people were making the case explicitly just that Mamdani was anti-Semitic. I think that was part of Cuomo's messaging in the primary. It didn't work at all. I mean, I shouldn't say it didn't work at all. Obviously, some people didn't vote for him on that basis, but it showed, I think, Jews that anti-Semitism, at least that version of anti-Semitism, is not something that resonates enough with voters to tip a race. And I think that has broader implications beyond New York City because it means, Mamdani, win or lose in New York, has demonstrated that other candidates can take these positions and can be accused of anti-Semitism without losing. So I think that has huge long-term implications for the party and for American politics. Talia mentioned some of the polling too. Obviously, the argument that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the exact same thing doesn't seem to resonate with a lot of American Jews. It's tricky. It depends how you parse things. But yeah, I think it has really big long-term implications, and I haven't seen anyone who were making those arguments previously really grapple with what that will mean or look like going forward. But it's certainly something that I'm monitoring.
I think you're sort of pointing to a deeper question also. And so Aaron Greenberg, you asked 1, 2, 3 questions in one. So I'm going to pick one of them. And Talia, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, which is, are we witnessing a deeper clash over what Jewish life and values mean today? There's a second part. If he becomes mayor, what do you think can be done to begin healing these divisions within the Jewish community?
Thank you for that, Julie and Aaron. I hope I got that name right. Yes, absolutely, is the short answer. Since the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023, we've seen these massive rifts open up in the Jewish community over what the attack meant, over what Israel's response has meant, over what the international response to Israel's response has meant. And many people have found that the degree of common ground, basically, in our shared understanding of what it means to be Jewish and what values that inherently implies is much, much smaller than we thought it was. I'm just going to go back to the 2 rabbis who I cited earlier, prominent rabbis in the same city, Rabbi Rachel Timoner at CBE in Brooklyn, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove at Park Ave Synagogue in Manhattan, both super respected Jewish leaders, completely sort of different reads on what Mamdani's criticism of Israel means, whether it makes him anti-Semitic or a threat. And when you have major Jewish leaders differing that openly and that significantly, it's a sign of the, deeper tensions. So I think the conversations we're having as a community around Mamdani's candidacy are 100% an extension of the painful, exhausting, meaningful, and formative conversations we've been having about Israel and its relationship to American Judaism since October 7th. If he becomes mayor, what can be done to begin healing those rifts? There's a sort of frustrating answer to that in my eyes, which is that Mamdani can keep doing what he's doing, which, as Jacob and Arno both, I thought, really effectively reflected, has been a lot of outreach to the Jewish community and a lot of effort to listen and have productive conversations, even as he continues to stand by his own very strong feelings about the Middle East. So Mamdani continue that work. He can continue trying to build relationships and mend relationships on his own. But ultimately, a mayor can't heal a people, he can't heal a city. And the rifts that American Jews are experiencing over this won't go away if Mamdani manages to make peace with every single Jew in New York City, which would be an amazing accomplishment, and I wish him luck with it. So, the bigger answer is really frustrating, but it's Jews have to talk to each other and listen to each other and try to find ways to connect that accept that we can have very different politics and potentially at this time more than any other in sort of living memory for most of us that our politics can feel really different in ways that feel almost existential and we're all still engaging in good faith. And so, Mamdani can talk to Jews and Jews can talk to each other and maybe someday that will lead to more healing.
I feel like that should be the very end of this program, but not yet, if only. So we have a bunch of questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. But there are a couple more related to sort of this what's next. One of them from Bella Center is both comment and question. I don't believe we should passively accept the shift in opinions about Israel. As progressive Jews, we need to find a way to fight the delegitimizing of Israel. Are there ways we can do this? I'm going to read a couple so that you three can choose the different parts of what's next that you want to respond to. So that's one from Bella Center. Another is let's assume from Judith Graham, let's assume that Mamdani wins. What's needed to reassure New Yorkers who harbor significant doubts about him? What should he do as he takes office to address this constituency? And a third is from Rena Toby, who says his Jewish outreach has been to very liberal congregations. For the rest of us, his mayoralty is terrifying. Have you heard Jews talking about leaving New York if he's elected? Whichever one of you wants to start answering first, unmute.
I will just issue a prediction. Nobody will move to New York because Mamdani wins. If they consider not paying more income tax, they might consider moving to Texas or to Florida, but not because of one particular candidate winning. The threat has been heard many times in the past. But I would say regarding how he would reach out to Jews as mayor, or some of the concerns that people have about his mayoralty is not necessarily what he has said about the conflicts or the legislation that he introduced in the assembly that some of his colleagues called anti-Semitic, but it's also about his associations. He's a member of the DSA. The DSA in New York City obviously was part of that protest on October 8th. And he, has allied and not disassociate themselves from some of those who have been rather critical of Israel and some considered anti-Semitic. And so the worries are that these people will either be part of the administration or influence his thinking on matters that matter to the Jewish community as mayor. He will not necessarily visit Israel, but and so it's not necessarily the rest of. I'll just preview what will happen next year, September, if Benjamin Netanyahu is still in office and he comes to the UN. And you have that controversy. Will he instruct the NYPD? Will he speak out? And so those are worries that people are concerned that he will take the conflict front and center, and that is not good for Jews. However, from engaging with Mamdani both on the campaign trail, interviewing him, speaking with him and his staff, and also watching his appearances, you see that nobody could deny that he's a very effective messenger and is a very effective communicator. And I believe that as mayor, your role changes from being a political candidate who is trying to win votes and assemble a coalition of voters to actually represent the more than 9 million people in the city. And that includes a large Jewish community and a large Muslim community. You won't have a mayor that necessarily only hosts a Jewish Heritage Month reception or only marches in the Israeli Day Parade. He will also consider both sides as being, having an open door to City Hall. And that is good for us. If we all applaud peace in the Middle East, we should applaud peace in New York City as well. And that should be part of the healing. And regarding of the other question was, how this would affect the future of politics here in New York City. You know, I recall in 2021, the last municipal election, there was this controversy. The DSA had this questionnaire that they asked candidates who were seeking their support to pledge not to travel to Israel. And there was this, whole controversy where candidates had to pledge that they would travel to Israel. And so you don't see that happening this year is because, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the conversation around the conflict has centered more about human rights and empathy for those who are suffering. And that is at times, an affront to those mainstream Jewish organizations, those advocacy organizations who seek their influence by advocating on these issues or speaking out on these issues. And under a possible Mayor Mamdani, they won't necessarily have the center seat at the table.
Um, I'm going to give you all a chance to say more about the future in a moment, but I do want to address one of the questions from Laura Sapiro. I hope I'm saying your last name right. Who asked, is the forward endorsing a candidate? It sounds like you're endorsing Mamdani. We are not endorsing the candidate. We have interviewed, Jacob interviewed Mamdani, I think was the first Jewish publication to interview Mamdani over a bowl of chicken soup. And Jacob has interviewed Cuomo. Jacob has interviewed Curtis Sliwa. And we have been committed to covering the race and to covering the range of opinions that people have expressed, to answering a range of questions about it. The interest around him has far outweighed the interest around other candidates. And so if the coverage seems a little lopsided, it has more to do with his people's unfamiliarity and confusion and anxiety and effort and need to understand. So that's why there's more of a focus on it. And actually, it prompts one of the questions that I've been curious about, and we've talked a little bit about before the program, which is, could there be a silent voting contingent that ends up electing Andrew Cuomo as mayor? Let's assume that Curtis Sliwa probably would not pull out a surprise, but the voices that we hear tend to be the loudest voices, and so do we think that there is a possibility, maybe related to the Jewish vote or to his positions on Israel, and maybe not. But I'm curious what the thinking is on that.
You want me to go?
Talia just unmuted, so I feel she's ready to say something.
Well, all I was going to say, and Jacob can give more of the sort of big picture of the New York City political landscape, but it's an impossible question to answer because we don't know what we don't know. What we do know is that there was a pretty decisive victory in the primary by Mamdani, and so far polls suggest that Cuomo and Sliwa are, neither one of them is getting enough of the vote to really pose a threat. We've seen polls be wrong in recent history, but usually they've been more one-off polls. The degree of surveying around this race, around this issue, has been extremely extensive. So anything is possible, but I would say that the likelihood that there is a silent majority out there that's not being caught in that kind of survey is relatively slim. I'm sure Jacob can give more detail on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's always this possibility of a silent vote, but that silent vote was very silent in the primary, and it remains silent as of now, um, both according to opinion polls and when you walk on the street, right? You don't see that fight on the street,
Right.
both for the Jewish vote or the anti-Mamdani. It's interesting because today I joined a Tehillim group on WhatsApp that people are distributing, saying Tehillim for the defeat of Mamdani. So there is that not necessarily silent vote, but faithful vote that they don't necessarily vote, but they're praying for Mamdani's defeat. And I would say, of course, there is this possibility that either Curtis Lewa withdraws from the race, or that Andrew Cuomo actually gains steam, has a very effective debate performance on Wednesday, and knocks Mamdani off his feet. A wave of support comes in, and he wins the primary. But what I would say is that it's very interesting to note that all of the polls show that Mamdani is consistent on around 45, 46%, and he is actually campaigning as a candidate who is below 50%. And that is effective because he's not running as this front runner with a Rose Garden strategy. He's actually running as the one lagging in the polls and campaigning. I get the schedules of all the candidates. He has a pretty packed schedule on a daily basis. I wouldn't mention that Bernie AOC rally that could mobilize his base. You're not seeing that both on the Republican side and on Andrew Cuomo's campaign, for the very reason that their base is very first of all, goes unnoticed, but also very uncertain. Curtis Lewa, one is the Republican nominee, but he's also not the typical Republican nominee because he's not supported by the leader of the Republican Party. He's not this conventional Republican, Rudy Giuliani or Joe Lhota Republican. And Andrew Cuomo is running as an independent, not necessarily as an independent, but as a Democrat who has lost the Democratic primary and just trying to have another shot. And so we're not definite that this would be the outcome, but what people are intrigued to hear is if Zohran Mamdani actually wins this election, whether the attacks against him are warranted, whether the worries about him are warranted, and whether he would actually act in a manner that would endanger the Jewish community. And for that, we are here both with the opinion, but also with the reporting on the ground that shows that he has done that outreach in order to earn the trust of voters, whether they vote for him or not. That will be known in a bit more than 2 weeks, probably, right?
Yes. And I vote in New York, so you all would know better than I do, because I don't live there, um, but we have about 6 minutes left. We have a couple of really good questions that I'm afraid we're not gonna get to. I'm just gonna read them in case you all have sort of want to do a quick round robin. One by Bill Braveman or Bravman. If Mamdani's elected and does meet his promise to vigorously oppose hate crimes versus Jews, does that have implications for the public discourse on anti-Semitism? Or no? Go, like in 90 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the people who think that Mamdani is a Nazi mayor from the, a proto-Nazi mayor are probably not going to be convinced by anything that he would do in office. Because I think that, to Talia's point, there's not much evidence that he, I think that's drawing on a well of emotion, and I think those emotions would likely continue to be present if he governs as a mayor who maintains this hostility toward Israel, regardless of what he does on hate crimes. I think for Jews who are on the fence, and this is certainly what I've heard much more than people threatening to move away from New York, is just people saying, like, I don't really know what to make of him. Like, it seems like he has this weird fixation on Israel that makes me really uncomfortable, but maybe I'm, reading too much into it, or maybe I'm getting caught up in the hype. I think if he gets into office and, defends or is silent in the face of hate crimes related to Israel, vandalism related to Israel, which we've seen during the war. Those people may feel like, oh yeah, I was right to be wary of this guy. And if he takes the opposite tack, then I think that they may shift their perspective. So that's my 90-second version.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, last question. And you've touched on this, but just again, sort of round robin, your 90-second answers. Jews are not a monolith, and there's not a single Jewish American future, but acknowledging that, what has this election shown us about the Jewish American future or the Jewish American futures?
I can jump in first on that. The foremost thing I think this election has shown us is that for many decades, the norm for major political figures was friendship toward Israel, or if not overt friendship, like moderate sort of acceptance of the necessity of a relationship. That's just been the norm throughout the country. It hasn't always applied to like Congress people who are representing less populous districts, let's say, or, small town mayors. It's not across the board. But for a figure as prominent as New York mayor, that's been absolutely the expectation. It's not going to be the expectation anymore. I think that it's possible that Mamdani is a one-off, that he's just this figure who's been at the right place at the right time with the right combination of qualities. My suspicion, based on what I see in my work, is that he may be uniquely adept as a politician, but he is representing a new wave within the sort of left political spectrum, that is going to reshape the American relationship with Israel. And as you said, American Jews are not a monolith. There are Jews who really care about this. There are Jews who don't really care about it. But it's coming for all of us. So that is the big thing that this is going to change in American Jewish life, to my eyes.
Yeah, I agree that the election of Mamdani in the primary proved that you don't have to be part of the chevra to be elected as mayor. And those who know that term is sort of you don't have to be either Jewish or pro-Israel to represent the largest city in the nation and the largest concentration of Jews outside of Israel. If you are an effective messenger with a good political team and you actually have a message with the right outreach to voters, you can win. And that applies to all of the races that we discussed, is that you don't necessarily, at the forward, we discussed the Jewish angle of politics. You don't necessarily need to be Jewish to voice that opinion or to represent the Jewish community.
Where you get the last word?
Yeah. Well, to close on perhaps a dour note, I mean, I think it's a disaster, and not just the race, but like, I mean, really, what do you do with the fact that 40, this was only one poll, but it aligns with other things. 40% of American Jews think Israel has committed genocide, and a huge portion of American Jews think that Mamdani is an anti-Semite for accusing Israel of genocide. I mean, obviously, Israel has always been a contentious subject in the community, but it seems like we are so far apart from having any sense of shared understanding about what anti-Semitism means, what Jewish safety means, what Israel means to American Jews. And I don't see, I just see that gulf getting bigger and bigger. And I think that the high level of emotion and intensity we've seen in the mayor's race is just a microcosm of that larger shift that I think will just continue to grow sort of exponentially. And I don't have an answer. I don't envy Talia trying to answer that question about what the solution is to bringing American Jews together, but I think that it's an urgent one because in the absence of any change in course, you have two segments of the community heading off in two, I mean, really 10 or 20, but two sort of cardinal directions. So yeah, I think it's a really big deal.
Well, to end on a slightly less dour note, without in any way suggesting that we're going to be answering these questions in the next newsletter that you receive from us, I will say that we really are committed to wrestling with these questions on our own behalf, on your behalf, on behalf of Jews across this country and others who are equally invested in American Jewish life. So thank you all for being here, for supporting us, and for being part of this particular program. Thank you, Talia, Jacob, Arno, for such a great conversation. And back to you, Rachel.
And thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of our panelists one more time. I mean, you have just captured why this is such an essential topic that people just like are totally mesmerized by. It is a really important topic. It's a microcosm of the challenges across the Jewish community. So thank you all. And thank you to all of us who joined us today and participated with your questions and comments. We are just beyond grateful to have your support. Without it, we couldn't be here. So you are deeply appreciated, especially at this time. We will be sending out the recording in the next few days, so watch for it in your email, and we'll include links to all of the articles that were referenced in the chat as well. And I have one favor to ask of you at this time that we think about uniting across Jewish divides. If you can think of at least one person that you can share the recording with, we're going to send it to you. It would be wonderful if you could think of someone else to send it to. The Forward's here for the whole community. We are always looking to spread the word about the work that the Forward is doing, and we need you to help us. So thank you for all your support so far and to come. Thank you again to our panelists. And a tiny bit late, I will say Shana Tova to all. I think we can just get it in there and on a positive note, and we'll see what happens. So keep reading the Forward, and thank you all. And we're gonna close the webinar. Thanks all. Good night.